The night Daniel Whitmore divorced his wife, she could barely stand without holding the edge of the table. Outside the tall windows of the Manhattan law office, the city glowed in cold winter light. Yellow taxis sliding through traffic 30 floors below, the quiet hum of ambition that never slept. Claire Whitmore sat across from the man she had once believed was the center of her world, her hands folded carefully in her lap so he wouldn't see them trembling. Just 2 weeks earlier, a doctor had told her the illness draining her strength could take months to recover from, maybe longer. She had expected concern, maybe patience. What she received instead was a stack of legal papers placed neatly on the polished walnut desk between them. Daniel didn't look angry. He didn't even look cruel. He simply looked finished. "I can't build my future dragging your weakness with me," he said calmly, adjusting the cuff of his tailored navy suit as if he were discussing a business contract instead of a marriage. The words hung in the room like cold air. Claire felt them settle slowly into her chest. For a moment, the city noise below seemed to disappear, replaced by the quiet realization that the life she had built for nearly 7 years had just ended with a sentence that simple. Once, Daniel had admired her mind, her steady instincts, the way she could see possibilities others missed. But success had a way of changing people. As his law firm rose through Manhattan's ruthless ranks, the dinners grew more expensive, the circles more exclusive, and the patience in his voice thinner every year. Illness, to a man obsessed with momentum, looked too much like failure. Claire looked down at the papers. The neat black lines spelled out the same cold conclusion Daniel had already delivered. Divorce. Asset separation. Final signatures. She could have argued. She could have reminded him of the nights she stayed awake helping him prepare cases when his firm was still small, of the quiet belief she had given him before anyone else saw his potential. But something in his eyes told her those memories no longer belonged to him. They belonged to a past he had already erased. So Claire reached for the pen. The silver tip felt heavier than it should have, as if the weight of 7 years had settled into that small piece of metal. She signed once. Then again. Daniel exhaled softly, almost relieved, gathering the papers with the efficient calm of a man closing a deal. Within 20 minutes it was done. The elevator ride down 30 floors felt longer than the entire marriage had. When the glass doors opened to the street, a sharp December wind rushed between the buildings, biting through her thin coat. Claire tightened her grip on the small suitcase beside her. Behind her, high above the avenue, Daniel Whitmore was already returning to the life he believed she could no longer keep up with. What he didn't know, what no one in that glittering city could possibly imagine, was that the quiet woman he had just erased was not disappearing forever. She was only stepping out of the story he thought he controlled. The first winter after the divorce felt longer than any season Claire Whitmore had ever lived through. Manhattan moved at the same relentless speed it always had. Yellow taxis rushing through slush-covered avenues, steam curling from subway grates. Men in expensive coats speaking urgently into their phones as they hurried toward another deal, another meeting, another victory. But Claire was no longer part of that rhythm. The small apartment she rented in a quiet neighborhood of Brooklyn was barely 600 square feet, a simple place with pale walls, a narrow kitchen, and a single window that looked out toward a row of brick buildings. It was nothing like the glass penthouse she had once shared with Daniel high above Central Park, yet the silence inside it felt honest. No reporters. No polished colleagues pretending sympathy. No whispers about the woman Daniel Whitmore had divorced when she became inconvenient. Recovery did not arrive all at once. Some mornings she woke with enough strength to walk several blocks to the neighborhood cafe where the smell of roasted coffee beans filled the air and strangers spoke softly over laptops and newspapers. Other mornings, even climbing the stairs to the street felt like a mile. But something small began to change inside her during those quiet months. The illness that once made her feel fragile slowly loosened its grip, and with every passing week her thoughts grew clearer, sharper, steadier. Claire had spent years standing beside a man whose ambition filled every room he entered, yet she had forgotten something important about herself. Long before she became Daniel Whitmore's wife, she had been a strategist. At 26, she had graduated near the top of her business program, known among her professors for seeing patterns others missed. She had the rare ability to look at a complicated problem and quietly discover the one path everyone else overlooked. That ability had helped Daniel build his first successful case when his firm was still small and desperate for credibility. Now, for the first time in years, that mind was finally working for her again. One afternoon, nearly 5 months after the divorce papers were signed, Claire sat by the window with her laptop open, studying financial reports the way some people studied novels. Venture capital movements, emerging technology firms, investment patterns moving west toward California. Silicon Valley appeared again and again in the numbers, a place where risk moved faster than reputation. And for someone rebuilding a life from nothing, that speed meant opportunity. The decision arrived quietly, the way most important choices do. Claire Whitmore would leave New York. 3 weeks later, she stepped off a plane in San Jose with one suitcase, a small savings account, and a mind that had begun to wake up again. The California air felt different from the sharp winter winds she had left behind. It carried the warm scent of eucalyptus and sun-heated pavement, the distant hum of innovation that seemed to pulse through every office park and coffee shop. Young founders worked late into the night inside buildings lit by rows of glowing computer screens, chasing ideas that might change the world or disappear before sunrise. For the first time since the night Daniel closed the door on their marriage, Claire felt something unfamiliar returning to her chest. Not anger, not regret. Something steadier, possibility. And somewhere in that restless valley of ambition, a young entrepreneur named Ethan Blake was about to build a company that would change everything. Silicon Valley had a rhythm that felt nothing like Manhattan. The mornings smelled of roasted coffee and warm asphalt instead of cold steel and ambition, and the people rushing through glass office buildings were younger, hungrier, and far less concerned with titles than with ideas. Claire Whitmore noticed it on her first day walking through a quiet business district in Palo Alto, where engineers in hooded sweatshirts discussed billion-dollar concepts while standing in line for breakfast burritos that cost $9 and change. No one knew who she used to be. No one whispered her name with sympathy or curiosity. In California, she was simply another newcomer carrying a laptop and a quiet determination to begin again. Claire started small. A temporary analyst position at a modest venture capital firm gave her access to the endless stream of startup pitches flowing through the valley. Every week, hopeful founders arrived with slide decks, prototypes, and dreams large enough to fill an entire auditorium. Most of them would fail. But Claire had always possessed a rare instinct for patterns. And within weeks, the partners began to notice that her observations during evaluation meetings were often more precise than the conclusions of investors with decades of experience. She did not speak loudly. She did not interrupt anyone. She simply waited, studied the numbers, and then pointed out the one detail everyone else had overlooked. That was how she first heard the name Ethan Blake. It appeared quietly on a proposal buried deep in a stack of early-stage presentations. 27 years old. Founder of a small artificial intelligence infrastructure startup operating out of a converted warehouse in Mountain View. The company had almost no press coverage, very little capital, and a business model that several senior analysts dismissed as unrealistic. But when Claire studied the technical roadmap, something about it felt different. The strategy was bold but precise, the type of architecture that could scale faster than most investors imagined if the right leadership guided it. A week later, she drove 30 miles south to see the company herself. The warehouse looked ordinary from the outside, a plain concrete building surrounded by a parking lot filled with used cars and bicycles. Inside, however, dozens of young engineers worked beneath bright industrial lights, their computer screens glowing with lines of code that moved like living language. At the center of the room stood Ethan Blake. He was tall, lean, and younger than Claire expected, wearing a faded gray sweater and speaking with the calm focus of someone who saw the future as clearly as other people saw the present. When he explained the company's long-term vision, Claire felt the same quiet certainty she once experienced when helping Daniel prepare a legal strategy that would eventually win a major case. The difference was that Ethan listened. When she asked questions, he did not dismiss them. When she offered an observation about the scalability of his platform, he paused and asked her to explain further. By the end of that afternoon conversation, something subtle had shifted. Ethan Blake did not see Claire Whitmore as a discarded wife from a distant city. He saw a strategist who understood the structure of his idea almost as clearly as he did. 2 months later, Claire left the venture capital firm and joined Ethan's company as an independent advisor. No press release announced the decision. No headlines followed the move. But inside that warehouse in Mountain View, a partnership had quietly begun that would one day reshape far more than a small startup struggling to survive. Success in Silicon Valley rarely arrived with fireworks. More often it grew quietly, like a signal slowly strengthening beneath layers of static. During the first year after Claire Whitmore joined Ethan Blake's small company, the warehouse in Mountain View became a place where long hours blurred into early mornings, and every small breakthrough felt like a step across uncertain ground. Rows of engineers worked beneath bright white lights while the smell of fresh coffee filled the air long after midnight. Ethan built the technology with relentless focus, but it was Claire who began shaping the direction of the company itself. She studied market movements the way a chess player studied a board, anticipating where larger corporations would move months before they realized it themselves. When investors visited the warehouse, most expected to see an inexperienced founder struggling to scale a complicated idea. Instead, they found a team guided by a quiet strategist who understood exactly which partnerships would unlock the company's growth. Claire never tried to control the spotlight. During meetings, she often stood near the back of the room with a tablet in her hand, listening carefully while Ethan presented the technical vision. Yet when the conversations shifted to funding strategy or long-term expansion, the tone of the room subtly changed. She asked questions that forced venture capital partners to reconsider assumptions. She pointed out inefficiencies in billion-dollar industries that most analysts had accepted as permanent. One by one, investors began requesting follow-up meetings. Within 18 months, the small warehouse company secured its first major funding round, raising more than $50 million from a group of technology investors who believed the platform could redefine how artificial intelligence infrastructure operated across global networks. The engineers celebrated with pizza boxes stacked on conference tables and music playing softly from someone's laptop. Ethan stood beside Claire near the wide warehouse window, looking out toward the quiet street where their small building stood among dozens of similar startups chasing impossible ideas. "You saw it before anyone else did," he said, his voice thoughtful rather than triumphant. Claire smiled slightly, the California sunset casting warm light across the glass. She had learned something important since leaving New York. Recognition was less important than direction. The company continued growing at a pace that surprised even experienced investors. By the end of the second year, the platform Ethan designed was supporting systems used by major technology firms across the country. Articles began appearing in business publications describing the young founder, whose company was expanding faster than analysts predicted. Reporters asked Ethan about the secret behind his strategy, and he often answered with the same quiet honesty. "Good ideas need the right structure," he told them during one interview. "I was fortunate to meet someone who understands how to build that structure." Most readers assumed he meant a team of engineers. Very few knew he was referring to Claire Whitmore. While headlines celebrated the rise of a new technology leader, Claire continued working with the same steady discipline she had practiced from the beginning. Each contract signed, each partnership formed, each strategic decision carefully positioned the company for the moment when it would no longer be considered a promising startup, but something far more powerful. And somewhere across the country in New York, Daniel Whitmore had no idea that the quiet woman he once dismissed as a burden was helping guide one of the fastest rising technology companies in America. By the third year, the small warehouse in Mountain View no longer looked like a startup struggling to survive. The parking lot outside filled each morning with electric cars and rideshare vehicles carrying engineers who had moved across the country to work on Ethan Blake's platform. Inside the building, the long rows of folding tables had been replaced with polished workstations, glass meeting rooms, and large digital screens tracking system activity across global networks. What began as an idea sketched on a whiteboard had grown into infrastructure used by technology companies from Seattle to Austin. Industry analysts started calling Ethan Blake the youngest chief executive officer leading one of the fastest expanding artificial intelligence platforms in America. Articles appeared in business magazines, describing him as a rare combination of visionary founder and disciplined strategist. Ethan read those articles with polite discomfort, because he understood something the headlines did not. The real turning points of the company had not happened during interviews or public demonstrations. They had happened during quiet late-night discussions when Claire Whitmore reviewed financial projections and calmly pointed toward the one decision that would move them ahead of competitors by an entire year. One evening after a long strategy meeting, Ethan stepped outside the office building where the California sky glowed with the soft orange light of sunset. Claire stood near the edge of the parking lot looking across the valley toward the distant hills. The warm air carried the faint scent of eucalyptus trees and distant ocean wind. Ethan leaned against the railing beside her and glanced toward the glass building behind them where dozens of engineers were still working. 3 years ago, this company barely existed, he said thoughtfully. Now every major firm in the industry is trying to figure out how we moved so fast. Claire watched a plane cross the sky above the valley, its lights blinking steadily as it moved toward San Francisco. She had learned not to measure progress by attention. Momentum mattered more than recognition. Speed was never the real advantage, she replied quietly. Direction was. Ethan studied her expression for a moment. During the past 3 years, he had come to understand that Claire rarely spoke about her past. She focused only on what came next. But the clarity of her decisions had shaped the company so deeply that even the investors began to notice her influence. Earlier that afternoon, the board of directors had approved the company's largest expansion yet, a national infrastructure partnership that would place their platform inside dozens of major enterprise systems. The contract alone was valued at nearly $1 billion over the next 5 years. The news would make headlines the following morning. There is something else, Ethan said after a moment, turning toward her. The Global Innovation Gala in New York contacted us today. They want to honor the company's growth this year. Apparently, they plan to introduce me as the youngest chief executive officer leading a company of this scale. Claire gave a small, thoughtful smile. New York. For a brief second, the memory of cold winter air and glass towers returned to her mind. The city where her old life had ended now stood on the other side of a very different future. Ethan noticed the quiet pause. You should come with me, he said. This company exists because of the decisions you made when no one else believed it would work. Claire looked toward the horizon where the last sunlight faded across the valley. 3 years earlier, she had walked out of Manhattan with nothing but a suitcase and a quiet determination to rebuild herself. Now the path ahead of her led back to the very city that once believed her story had ended. And somewhere inside those tall glass buildings, Daniel Whitmore still believed the same thing. News about the Global Innovation Gala traveled quickly through the technology world because the event had become one of the most visible stages where emerging companies were introduced to the highest levels of industry leadership. Every year, the ballroom filled with investors, founders, executives, and journalists who watched carefully for signals about where the future of technology might be heading next. This year, the name appearing at the center of the program surprised almost everyone. Ethan Blake, the youngest chief executive officer leading one of the fastest-growing artificial intelligence infrastructure companies in the United States. The announcement appeared first on a financial news website late on a Tuesday afternoon. Within hours, several major publications repeated the headline, describing how the company Ethan built had secured a national infrastructure partnership valued at nearly $1 billion over 5 years. Investors discussed the news across conference calls and private messages. Competitors studied the numbers with quiet concern. Very few people knew that the strategy behind that expansion had been shaped by someone whose name did not appear in those headlines. Across the country, in New York City, the news reached Daniel Whitmore during a late meeting at his law firm overlooking Midtown Manhattan. The conference room windows reflected the city lights stretching across the skyline as associates reviewed documents for a major corporate merger the firm hoped to finalize before the end of the quarter. Daniel listened with half attention while scrolling through financial headlines on his tablet. One article caught his eye immediately. The headline described the rapid rise of Ethan Blake's company and the upcoming gala where the young founder would be honored. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, studying the details with professional curiosity. Technology firms were becoming powerful clients for corporate law practices, and companies growing at that speed often required legal representation for acquisitions, intellectual property protection, and international expansion. The name Ethan Blake was unfamiliar, but the scale of the company's growth suggested that new legal opportunities might soon appear. Around the table, the conversation shifted toward another topic. Yet Daniel's mind remained on the article glowing across his screen. For a brief moment, he wondered what kind of strategist had helped guide a company from a small warehouse startup to a billion-dollar infrastructure partnership in less than 3 years. Ambitious founders often relied on experienced advisors to build structures capable of sustaining that kind of expansion. Somewhere inside that organization, there had to be someone capable of seeing the long-term strategy clearly. Daniel closed the article and returned his attention to the meeting, unaware that the answer to that question was someone he believed had vanished from his life long ago. Meanwhile, on the opposite coast, Claire Whitmore stood inside a quiet dressing room in San Francisco several weeks later, studying the elegant emerald evening gown laid carefully across a chair. The Global Innovation Gala invitation rested on the nearby table beside a small silver clutch and a pair of understated heels. The soft fabric of the dress caught the warm light from the window as the sun began setting across the bay. Claire touched the edge of the material thoughtfully. 3 years earlier, she had left New York carrying nothing but a suitcase and a determination to rebuild her life away from the place where it had quietly collapsed. Now she was preparing to walk back into that same city under circumstances no one there could possibly expect. Behind her, the door opened softly as Ethan stepped into the room, wearing a simple black suit that contrasted with his usual casual style. He glanced toward the gown and smiled. "The flight leaves in 2 hours," he said calmly. Claire looked once more at the skyline outside the window where the last golden light reflected across the water. Somewhere on the other side of the country, the past she once carried like a weight was still waiting in a city of glass towers and bright lights. And very soon that past was about to see her again. The flight from San Francisco to New York crossed nearly 3,000 miles of quiet sky. But for Claire Whitmore, the distance felt less like travel and more like a slow turning page in a story she had once believed was finished. From the window seat, the clouds stretched endlessly beneath the aircraft, glowing pale gold in the late afternoon sunlight. Ethan Blake sat across the aisle reviewing a series of notes on his tablet, the calm focus that had helped him build a company now directed toward the speech he would deliver that evening. For him, the gala was another professional milestone, an opportunity to present the future of the technology they had spent years developing. For Claire, it was something far more personal. She had not returned to New York since the winter afternoon when she stepped out of Daniel Whitmore's office carrying a small suitcase and the quiet certainty that the life she once knew was over. As the plane began its descent hours later, the familiar skyline emerged through the fading light. Manhattan rose from the water like a forest of glass and steel, the towers reflecting the deep blue of the early evening sky. From above, the city looked exactly as Claire remembered it, restless and bright. A place where ambition never paused long enough to notice who had fallen behind. Yet the woman watching from the airplane window was no longer the person who had left 3 years earlier. The car waiting at the airport carried them through the city streets toward Midtown, where the Global Innovation Gala would take place inside one of the most elegant hotels overlooking Park Avenue. The entrance already glowed with warm golden lights as guests arrived in black cars that pulled quietly to the curb one after another. Inside the ballroom, enormous crystal chandeliers cast soft reflections across polished marble floors, while journalists and photographers positioned themselves near the entrance, hoping to capture the arrival of the evening's most anticipated guest. Ethan adjusted the cuff of his black suit while standing beside Claire in the hotel's quiet reception lounge just outside the ballroom. The emerald gown she wore reflected the light like a calm surface of water, elegant but understated. The same balance of quiet strength she had carried with her through every decision since leaving the city. Ethan glanced toward the crowded entrance where cameras flashed as new guests arrived. "They are expecting the youngest chief executive officer," he said with a faint smile. "They are not expecting the person who helped build everything behind the scenes." Claire met his eyes calmly. Recognition had never been the reason she stayed beside the company as it grew from a small warehouse into a national platform. Direction had always mattered more than attention. Across the ballroom, the master of ceremonies reviewed the evening's program, while servers moved between tables placing glasses and silverware for hundreds of guests representing the most powerful companies in the technology world. Among them, several rose from the stage. Daniel Whitmore sat with 2 partners from his law firm discussing the strategic implications of emerging artificial intelligence companies. The law firm had been invited because large technology companies often required legal expertise as they expanded across international markets. Daniel listened with professional interest as the conversation turned toward the rapid rise of Ethan Blake's company. None of the men at the table realized that the strategist who helped guide that company's expansion was standing only a few rooms away preparing to enter the ballroom. The orchestra began a soft instrumental piece as the evening formally opened. Outside the tall double doors, Claire Whitmore paused for a brief moment before stepping forward. 3 years earlier, she had left this city believing she was walking away from the end of her story. Tonight, she was returning to show the world that the story had only just begun. The heavy doors of the ballroom opened slowly, releasing a wave of warm light and quiet music into the corridor where Claire Whitmore and Ethan Blake stood waiting. Inside, the Global Innovation Gala had already begun. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above hundreds of guests seated at round tables draped in white linen, their conversations blending into the soft hum of power and ambition that filled the room. Journalists lined the far wall with cameras ready, watching the entrance carefully because the program had already hinted that the youngest chief executive officer in the technology industry would arrive shortly. Ethan stepped forward first with the calm confidence that had made investors trust him with billions of dollars in infrastructure partnerships. The moment he entered the ballroom, a few heads turned, then a few more. Recognition moved through the crowd in quiet ripples as people whispered his name to one another. Ethan Blake, the founder whose company had expanded faster than analysts predicted. The man every major technology firm was suddenly watching. He paused just inside the doorway and turned slightly, extending his arm behind him. Claire Whitmore stepped into the ballroom beside him, her emerald gown catching the soft golden light from the chandeliers above. The color moved like liquid glass as she walked across the polished floor. For most of the guests, she was simply a poised woman accompanying the evening's most anticipated honoree. But for one man seated several rows from the stage, the moment felt like the air had suddenly left the room. Daniel Whitmore had been listening to a colleague explain the legal complexities of emerging technology patents when a shift in the crowd drew his attention toward the entrance. At first, he saw only the tall young chief executive officer surrounded by curious investors and reporters. Then he noticed the woman walking beside him. For a fraction of a second, his mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. Claire Whitmore had once been a quiet presence beside him at charity dinners and professional gatherings, always standing slightly behind the circle of executives who dominated the conversations. The woman walking beside Ethan Blake tonight was unmistakably the same person, yet she carried herself with a calm confidence Daniel had never noticed before. Her posture was steady, her expression composed, her presence impossible to ignore. Conversations around the ballroom softened as more guests began to recognize Ethan and the elegant woman beside him. Cameras lifted slightly as photographers realized they were witnessing the arrival everyone had been waiting for. Daniel felt an unfamiliar tension settle in his chest as he watched them move across the room toward the front tables reserved for honored guests. 3 years earlier, he had signed divorce papers believing Claire's chapter in his life had quietly closed. Yet here she was, walking into one of the most influential technology events in the country beside the very man whose company had just secured a billion-dollar national partnership. At the front of the ballroom, Ethan paused to greet the event organizers while Claire stood beside him beneath the soft glow of the chandeliers. From across the room, Daniel could not hear their conversation, but he saw the subtle respect in the way executives greeted them both. Something about the scene refused to fit the story he had once believed. The master of ceremonies stepped toward the stage microphone as the orchestra faded into silence. The program was about to begin, and the next few minutes would reveal something Daniel Whitmore had never imagined about the woman he once believed was too weak to share his future. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage beneath the crystal chandeliers, his voice calm and practiced as the soft music faded across the ballroom. Conversations slowly quieted until the entire room turned its attention toward the front. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Global Innovation Gala," he began, his words echoing gently across the vast hall. "Tonight we celebrate the minds shaping the future of technology." At the front table, Ethan Blake sat beside Claire Whitmore, his posture relaxed but attentive as the program unfolded. Across the room, Daniel Whitmore leaned slightly forward in his chair, unable to stop his eyes from drifting back toward the woman seated beside the young chief executive officer. The sight unsettled him in a way he could not easily explain. Claire had once seemed almost invisible during the corporate gatherings he attended in New York, standing politely beside him while he spoke with clients and partners. Tonight the room seemed to bend subtly around her presence, as if people sensed something important without yet understanding why. The master of ceremonies continued introducing several industry leaders whose companies had made notable breakthroughs during the year. Polite applause followed each recognition. Glasses clinked softly on tabletops while servers moved quietly between guests carrying trays of sparkling water and wine. Then the tone of the evening shifted. The host paused for a moment, glancing toward the center table before speaking again. Our final recognition tonight honors a company whose rapid expansion has reshaped the conversation around artificial intelligence infrastructure across the United States, he said. A murmur moved through the audience because everyone knew which name would come next. In just 3 years, this company has grown from a small warehouse operation in Mountain View to a national platform supporting major technology networks across the country. Please join me in welcoming the youngest chief executive officer leading a company of this scale, Ethan Blake. The ballroom filled with applause as Ethan rose from his chair and walked toward the stage. Cameras lifted immediately. Daniel watched carefully, impressed despite himself by the calm confidence of the young founder whose company was now worth billions. Yet even as Ethan accepted the applause, Daniel's attention returned again and again to Claire sitting quietly at the table beneath the chandeliers. Something about the way several executives leaned toward her with respectful nods hinted at a story he did not yet understand. On stage, Ethan thanked the audience and the investors who had supported the company's early growth. His voice carried clearly across the room. Innovation rarely happens alone, he said thoughtfully. Behind every company people celebrate tonight is someone who helped guide the vision when the path was still uncertain. Daniel felt a strange stillness settle in his chest as Ethan paused, glancing toward the table where Claire sat. The room followed his gaze almost instinctively. 3 years ago, I had an idea and a small group of engineers working out of a converted warehouse, Ethan continued. But the person who helped turn that idea into a company capable of changing an entire industry is someone who never asked for recognition. A soft ripple of curiosity moved through the ballroom. Ethan's next words would reveal something that would shift the entire room's attention in a direction no one had expected. Ethan Blake stood quietly at the center of the stage, the applause fading slowly as hundreds of eyes remained fixed on him. The chandeliers above reflected soft light across the ballroom, while journalists held their cameras steady, sensing that the speech was moving towards something unexpected. Ethan paused for a moment, his gaze shifting across the room before settling on the table near the front where Claire Whitmore sat. Daniel Whitmore noticed the movement instantly. The young chief executive officer was not looking toward the investors or the board members who had helped finance the company. He was looking directly at the woman Daniel once believed had disappeared from his life. Ethan spoke again, his voice steady and clear. When people talk about innovation, they often imagine brilliant ideas appearing suddenly, he said. But in reality, progress happens because someone sees the structure behind the idea before anyone else does. The room remained silent, the audience leaning forward slightly. 3 years ago, my company was operating out of a small warehouse in Mountain View. We had a talented group of engineers and a vision for building a new kind of artificial intelligence infrastructure. But we did not yet have the strategy that would allow the company to grow beyond that building. Daniel felt his attention sharpen as the story continued. Ethan rested one hand lightly on the podium. The person who helped create that strategy never asked to stand on this stage, he said. She simply believed in the idea when the company had no investors, no recognition, and no guarantee that it would succeed. A quiet ripple of curiosity moved through the ballroom. Ethan turned slightly toward the audience, his expression warm with respect. Tonight, I would like to recognize the strategist who helped build the foundation of everything we have accomplished. He lifted his hand gently, gesturing toward the table beneath the chandeliers. Claire Whitmore. For a moment, the name seemed to float through the air before the audience reacted. Heads turned across the ballroom in the direction Ethan indicated. Claire sat calmly at the table, the emerald fabric of her gown catching the light as dozens of people suddenly focused their attention on her. Daniel Whitmore felt a sudden stillness settle over him. The sound of the room seemed to blur into distant noise as the reality of what he was hearing slowly formed in his mind. Claire Whitmore, the woman he once described as a burden, had just been introduced as the strategist behind one of the fastest-growing technology companies in the country. Applause began to spread across the room, first politely, and then with genuine enthusiasm as guests recognized the significance of Ethan's words. Several investors leaned toward Claire with surprised admiration. Journalists quickly wrote her name into their notes. On stage, Ethan smiled slightly, waiting for the applause to settle before continuing. Claire never asked for recognition, he said. But the truth is simple. Without her insight, this company would not exist in the form you see today. Daniel watched as Claire rose gracefully from her chair. The calm confidence in her expression felt entirely unfamiliar to the memory he carried from years earlier. She walked toward the stage with steady steps, the quiet respect of the entire ballroom following her movement. In that moment, Daniel realized something he had never considered before. The woman he once believed had reached her weakest point had not disappeared after their divorce. She had simply stepped into a future far larger than anything he had imagined. The applause continued as Claire Whitmore walked toward the stage, the sound echoing beneath the chandeliers while hundreds of guests watched her with a mixture of curiosity and growing respect. The polished marble floor reflected the emerald shimmer of her gown as she approached the podium where Ethan Blake stood waiting. He stepped slightly aside, offering the microphone to her with the quiet gesture of someone acknowledging a partner rather than a guest. Claire paused for a moment beside him, looking out across the ballroom filled with executives, investors, and journalists whose attention was now focused entirely on her. For 3 years, she had worked quietly behind strategy meetings, financial projections, and expansion plans that had guided Ethan's company through its most critical decisions. Standing in front of the room was never the goal. Yet the moment did not feel uncomfortable. It felt simply like another step in a long path she had chosen to walk. Across the ballroom, Daniel Whitmore sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the stage as the woman he once believed could not keep up with his ambitions now stood at the center of one of the most influential technology events in the country. Claire's voice carried clearly through the microphone when she began to speak. "Thank you, Ethan," she said calmly. "But the truth is that every company recognized tonight represents the work of people who believed in an idea long before the rest of the world noticed it." Her tone was steady, thoughtful rather than dramatic. 3 years ago, when Ethan first described the vision for this platform, it was not obvious to most investors that the infrastructure could scale across entire industries. But sometimes progress begins quietly, with a small group of people willing to keep building even when the path forward is uncertain. She paused briefly, glancing toward Ethan with a faint smile. "What impressed me most was not the technology itself. It was the clarity of the idea behind it. Once you see that clearly enough, the strategy begins to reveal itself." Several guests nodded with interest as she spoke. The calm precision of her explanation made it clear that the growth of the company had never been accidental. It had been designed carefully from the beginning. Daniel listened from across the room, feeling the strange realization settle deeper with every word she spoke. Claire Whitmore had once sat quietly beside him while he explained legal strategies to corporate clients. Yet the woman on stage now spoke with the same strategic clarity he had once believed belonged only to him. Claire finished her brief remarks by turning back toward Ethan. "Companies grow because people trust one another with big ideas," she said simply. "I am grateful that Ethan trusted me with his." The audience responded with another wave of applause as she stepped slightly aside, allowing Ethan to conclude the recognition ceremony. Cameras flashed softly along the walls while journalists updated their notes, now fully aware that the story of Ethan Blake's company had just revealed a far more interesting dimension. At his table, Daniel Whitmore remained silent, the applause around him fading into distant noise. For the first time since the night he signed the divorce papers, he understood that the woman he once believed had reached her lowest point had quietly rebuilt a future that placed her on a stage he had never imagined she would stand upon. The applause slowly softened as Claire Whitmore stepped away from the podium, returning to her seat beside Ethan Blake while the evening program continued. Around the ballroom, conversations resumed with a different tone than before. Executives who had spent the first part of the night discussing technology trends now leaned toward one another with quiet curiosity, repeating the name they had just heard on stage. Claire Whitmore, the strategist behind one of the fastest-growing infrastructure companies in the country. Several journalists quietly moved closer to the front tables, hoping to capture a better look at the woman who had just been introduced to the industry in a single unexpected moment. Claire accepted the attention with the same calm composure she had carried throughout the evening. Recognition had never been the goal that guided her decisions. What mattered was the direction of the work she had helped build. Ethan leaned slightly toward her as the orchestra began another soft instrumental piece across the ballroom. "You handled that exactly the way I expected," he said quietly, his tone warm with appreciation. Claire smiled faintly. "It was your company that brought everyone here tonight." Ethan shook his head gently. "It was our strategy that built it." Across the room, Daniel Whitmore sat in silence while the conversation at his table continued around him. One of his colleagues was now discussing the legal implications of infrastructure platforms like Ethan's expanding across multiple international markets. Another partner speculated that their law firm might soon receive requests for representation from companies competing in the same space. Daniel heard the words, but did not fully process them. His attention remained fixed on the front of the ballroom, where Claire sat beside Ethan speaking quietly with a group of investors who had approached their table. The sight unsettled him in ways he could not easily explain. For years he had measured success by visible achievements. Titles, promotions, recognition within the professional circles that shaped Manhattan's corporate world. Claire had once seemed almost too quiet for that environment. Too patient, too thoughtful. Yet the woman seated beneath the chandeliers now carried the quiet authority of someone who had built something lasting without needing to announce it. The realization settled slowly in his mind that the story he believed about her had always been incomplete. The orchestra music softened again as the master of ceremonies returned briefly to the stage to introduce the final portion of the evening. Guests applauded politely while servers delivered the last course of the dinner. Throughout the room, small groups continued discussing the speech Ethan had given and the strategist he had revealed to the audience. Some guests had already begun searching for information about Claire Whitmore on their phones, only to discover that very little existed publicly about her work over the past 3 years. She had built an entire strategy behind the scenes without seeking attention. At the front table, Ethan and Claire continued speaking with several executives who expressed interest in future partnerships. Their conversations were focused, practical, forward-looking. The company's next stage of expansion would require careful planning, and tonight's recognition had only increased the number of opportunities appearing on the horizon. Daniel watched from across the ballroom as Claire rose briefly to greet another group of guests approaching their table. The confidence in her posture and the clarity in her expression made one thing unmistakably clear. The woman he once believed had reached the weakest moment of her life had quietly built a future powerful enough to reshape an entire industry. And as the evening moved toward its close, Daniel Whitmore understood that the distance between the life he once shared with Claire and the life she now lived was far greater than the 3,000 miles that separated New York from California. The final portion of the evening unfolded beneath the soft glow of the chandeliers as the orchestra played a gentle closing arrangement that filled the ballroom with quiet elegance. Guests slowly rose from their tables, conversations flowing more freely now that the formal ceremony had ended. Executives exchanged business cards, journalists discussed the stories they would publish the following morning, and investors approached Ethan Blake with renewed interest in the company that had captured the attention of the entire room. Yet the quiet center of that attention remained the woman standing beside him. Claire Whitmore spoke calmly with a small group of technology leaders who had gathered near the front of the ballroom. Their questions were thoughtful and direct, asking about the strategy behind the company's expansion and the future of artificial intelligence infrastructure across national networks. Claire answered with the same steady clarity she had shown on stage, describing the importance of building systems that could scale responsibly as industries adopted more advanced technologies. She spoke not with the urgency of someone seeking approval, but with the calm perspective of someone who had already spent years shaping the direction of the work. Across the ballroom, Daniel Whitmore remained near his table long after several of his colleagues had begun moving toward the exit. He watched the scene unfold with a quiet understanding that something far more significant than a business recognition had taken place that evening. 3 years earlier, he had believed he was closing a chapter of his life that no longer fit his ambitions. He had measured Claire by the circumstances of a moment when she appeared fragile and uncertain. But standing in the ballroom now, observing the respect she commanded among some of the most influential leaders in the technology world, Daniel realized how incomplete that judgment had been. Claire had not disappeared after leaving New York. She had simply stepped into a different environment where her strengths could grow without being overlooked. At the front of the room, Ethan finished speaking with a group of investors and turned back toward Claire with a relaxed smile. "It seems the evening created more opportunities than we expected," he said quietly. Claire glanced toward the tall windows overlooking Park Avenue where the lights of the city shimmered against the night sky. "That tends to happen when people finally see what has been there all along," she replied softly. Outside the hotel, the cool New York air carried the familiar sounds of traffic and distant city life. As Claire and Ethan walked toward the entrance, several journalists politely asked if they might schedule interviews in the coming weeks to discuss the future of the company's platform. Ethan assured them that his team would arrange it. Claire listened calmly, understanding that the quiet work she had done for 3 years would now become more visible than she had ever planned. Near the doorway, she paused for a brief moment and looked back across the ballroom one last time. Daniel Whitmore still stood near his table, his expression thoughtful as their eyes met across the distance. There was no anger in her gaze and no desire for vindication. The past no longer carried that weight. Claire simply offered a small, polite nod before turning toward the exit. Outside, the city lights reflected across the dark glass towers of Manhattan, just as they always had. But as the car carried her away from the hotel beside Ethan Blake, one truth remained quietly certain. The moment Daniel Whitmore once believed was the end of her story had only been the beginning of a future far stronger than either of them could have imagined.